Money in the NBA can change everything overnight. One signature, one press conference, one massive contract extension, and suddenly a franchise believes it has secured its future. Fans celebrate. Analysts praise the commitment. Jerseys fly off shelves. The narrative is simple. This is the guy. And sometimes, for a brief moment, it's true. But the NBA doesn't run on emotions. It runs on production. It runs on health. It runs on fit. And when any of those collapse, even a contract that once looked good can turn into an anchor that drags an entire franchise underwater. This is the story of NBA contracts that made sense at the time, but quickly became horrendous. Let's start with a deal that once felt justified. When Chandler Parsons signed a 4-year, $94 million contract with the Memphis Grizzlies in 2016, the logic was understandable. Parsons had averaged nearly 16 points per game in Dallas. He was a 6'9" wing who could shoot, pass, and stretch the floor. This was during the 2016 salary cap explosion, when the NBA's new TV deal flooded teams with cash. It wasn't just Memphis spending wildly, almost everyone was. Parsons looked like a modern forward who could help transition the gritty grit and grind Grizzlies into a more versatile offense. But injuries had already started creeping in during his Dallas tenure, and once he arrived in Memphis, his body simply didn't hold up. Over the course of 4 seasons, Parsons played only 95 total games for the Grizzlies. 95 for $94 million. The problem wasn't that the contract was insane on day one. The problem was health. And when health disappears, so does value. The Grizzlies were forced to attach assets just to move off his contract later. A deal that once looked aggressive but logical turned into one of the most cited cautionary tales of the cap spike era. And Parsons wasn't alone in that chaotic summer of 2016. When Joakim Noah signed a 4-year, $72 million contract with the New York Knicks, it felt like a culture move. Noah was a former Defensive Player of the Year. He had been the emotional heartbeat of Chicago. He brought toughness, passing ability, and leadership. The Knicks believed they were adding identity. Instead, they added decline. Noah's body broke down almost immediately. Injuries limited him to just 53 games in his first season. Then came suspensions, more injuries, and eventually exile from the rotation. By 2018, the Knicks were stretching his contract just to create cap flexibility. On paper, signing a former DPOY to anchor your defense didn't sound reckless. In reality, it became dead money that lingered for years. Here's the brutal truth about NBA contracts. You're not paying for what a player has done. You're paying for what they're about to do. And predicting that is incredibly difficult. Take Blake Griffin and the 5-year, $171 million extension he signed with the Los Angeles Clippers in 2017. At the time, Griffin was still an all-NBA level talent. The Clippers even held a dramatic presentation selling him as a Clipper for life. Months later, they traded him. Detroit took on the contract, and to Griffin's credit, he delivered an all-NBA season in 2018-19 with the Detroit Pistons, averaging 24.5 points per game and carrying them to the playoffs. For a moment, it looked salvageable. Then the injuries returned. Knee issues robbed him of explosiveness. The massive salary, over $36 million per year, became immovable. By 2200, Detroit negotiated a buyout, paying him to leave. This wasn't about effort. Griffin competed. It was about the brutal reality of athletic decline. When your game relies heavily on explosion and your body betrays you, the numbers no longer match the paycheck. And sometimes, it's not injuries. Sometimes it's performance regression. Consider Gilbert Arenas and his 6-year, $111 million deal with the Washington Wizards in 2008. Arenas was electric. A 3-time All-Star, one of the league's most fearless scorers, but knee injuries had already begun limiting him before the contract even kicked in. Then came the infamous locker room firearm incident, resulting in suspension and long-term damage to his reputation. The Wizards were left paying superstar money for minimal production. What once seemed like a franchise commitment turned into a public relations and financial disaster. Let me ask you something. How many of these deals actually looked terrible the moment they were signed? Very few. Most were defended by analysts. Most had logical arguments behind them. That's what makes the fall so dramatic. Let's talk about fit. When Russell Westbrook signed his supermax extension with the Oklahoma City Thunder in 2017, it felt symbolic. He had just won MVP. He averaged a triple-double. He stayed loyal after Kevin Durant left. Oklahoma City rewarded him. The contract itself wasn't absurd in that moment. He had earned it. But supermax deals consume massive cap space, over $40 million annually in Westbrook's case. As his athleticism declined and his fit with modern spacing became more complicated, that contract became harder to build around. It wasn't just OKC. The deal followed him to Houston, then Washington, then the Los Angeles Lakers. Each stop came with increasing difficulty and roster construction. The Lakers' experiment in particular showed how a max contract can limit flexibility. Depth evaporates, shooting becomes scarce, margin for error shrinks. The contract wasn't horrendous on signing day. It became horrendous when production no longer matched the price. And sometimes, the issue is expectation. When Tobias Harris signed a 5-year, $180 million contract with the Philadelphia 76ers in 2019, the logic was about continuity. Philadelphia had just traded significant assets to acquire him. Letting him walk would have been disastrous, so they paid him. Harris has been solid, professional, productive. But $180 million demands star-level impact. When fans compare that salary slot to other max-level players around the league, scrutiny intensifies. It limits flexibility. It creates constant trade rumors. Even good production can feel underwhelming when the number attached to it is enormous. Not every bad contract means the player failed. Sometimes the structure creates the problem. Another example is John Wall and his 4-year, $170 million supermax with the Washington Wizards. Wall was a 5-time All-Star, a dynamic point guard in his prime. Then came the Achilles rupture. Achilles injuries are devastating, especially for guards who rely on speed. Wall missed nearly 2 full seasons. By the time he returned, his explosiveness was diminished, and Washington was paying over $40 million annually for a player trying to rediscover himself. Eventually, he was traded for Westbrook, another massive contract swap. 2 enormous deals, each viewed as burdens by their respective teams. Think about that. 2 all-star point guards, 2 supermax contracts, both considered liabilities within a few years. This is the razor's edge of NBA team building. Now let's revisit the 2016 cap spike one more time. Bismack Biyombo signed a 4-year, $72 million deal with the Orlando Magic after a strong playoff run with Toronto. In those playoffs, he looked like a defensive anchor, shot blocking, rebounding, energy. Orlando bet on that momentum. But playoff flashes don't always translate into long-term consistency. Biyombo struggled to justify the offensive limitations that came with his defensive skill set. Within 2 seasons, the contract was widely viewed as excessive. Here's the pattern: short-term spikes in performance, massive cap space, optimism overriding caution. And then reality sets in. But sometimes, it's not decline or injury, it's timing. Ben Simmons signed a 5-year, $170 million extension with the Philadelphia 76ers in 2019. At the time, he was a multi-time All-Star, Defensive Player of the Year candidate, and elite playmaker. Then the 2021 playoffs happened. Offensive struggles became magnified. Confidence appeared shaken. Trade demands followed. Back injuries emerged. The contract didn't suddenly change. His trajectory did. After being traded to the Brooklyn Nets, availability and performance concerns continued. A deal that once symbolized franchise faith became one of the most scrutinized in the league. Let's pause for a second. Imagine being a general manager. You have a 25-year-old all-star. The market says max him. The fans say max him. Letting him walk would be organizational malpractice. You sign him? 2 years later, circumstances change. And now that same contract is criticized relentlessly. This is the risk of long-term guarantees in a league where careers can pivot overnight. And it's not always about players declining. Sometimes, it's about the league evolving faster than a contract's timeline. Stretch big men who can't defend in space became less valuable. Traditional post scorers lost leverage. Non-shooting guards face spacing challenges. Contracts signed under one meta can look outdated under another. The NBA salary cap continues to rise, but so do expectations. Every max slot carries enormous pressure, and when production dips, even slightly, narratives shift instantly. And sometimes, a contract doesn't need to be historically bad to feel horrendous. It just needs to limit flexibility, to trap a team in mediocrity, to block a rebuild. That's the real cost. It's not just the money paid, it's the opportunity lost. Cap space tied up, draft assets attached to dump deals. Years of competitive windows shrinking. The difference between contender and treadmill team can be one miscalculated contract. And yet, teams will keep taking the risk. Because when it works, when a max deal locks in a true superstar, it changes everything. But when it doesn't, it becomes a cautionary tale repeated on sports talk shows for years. So the next time you see a massive extension announced and social media explodes with excitement, remember this: a contract isn't judged on signing day. It's judged 2 years later, 3 years later, when injuries hit, when production dips, when flexibility disappears. That's when we find out whether it was a commitment or a catastrophe. And in the NBA, the line between those two is razor thin.